Ukrainian prisoners are coming home from Russian captivity, many shocked that they were not forgotten and that people were still waiting for them. Their testimonies point to systematic abuse in detention. At the same time, Russia is facing real problems on the battlefield as Starlink limits disrupt its drone and communication capability. My guest is Shaun, former British soldier, Ukrainian Marine and former prisoner of war. Shaun, I'm happy to see you here, and I think you are just the right person today for my show to talk.
Well, it's good to be back again. Certainly, I do have some pedigree in this subject.
Yeah. So, Shaun, for Ukraine, the recent prisoner exchange was a good day. 157 Ukrainian prisoners of war returned home from Russian captivity, and I listened to their first interviews with the journalists, and one thing really struck me, that many of them were surprised that people were waiting for them with the flags and cheers and hugs. And, some even asked, is this really for us? Are you here for us? And you, as a person who spent months in Russian captivity in 2022, what happens to a person's psyche in detention? Beyond torture, how would you describe the psychological pressure there?
But there's a lot to unpack there, to be honest. Before you even get to actually the point where you're released and you're in the free world, back in the free world again. Essentially, when you're captured, is probably the most dangerous point of your whole captivity because of the unpredictability. If you get through that, then your initial point of capture being the most dangerous, you should have a better chance of survival once you're through that initial capture. Some of these people have been in for 4 years where they've been, I use myself as an example. I was held in a 1 meter by 3 meter broom cupboard for 60 days where I didn't even see the sun underground, being fed just bread and water. So, a lot of these guys have been through those same traumas. Life did get a bit better in a bigger prison, which was probably double the diameter that I just said. And in that prison, you're stuck in a regime that's essentially 23, 24 hours a day in a cell. You're lucky if you get an hour walk, and each day just becomes a groundhog day. And any news you do get is really filtered and through the state media outlets. So it's not real news, and you might get to watch a TV or get hear a snippet on a radio, but essentially you have no idea what's going on in the real world, and only through guards and what you hear. And that media is so heavily regulated and sanitized. Even when I was in captivity, the prisoners would complain that the news wasn't accurate, because while in Makivka, where I was, they were saying that the surrounding area was under control and Russians were making good headway out from Makivka. What had become apparent is the Ukrainians actually had advanced within 4 kilometers of the prison and were dropping artillery rounds in the prison. When I first got there, that wasn't happening. So clearly, the propaganda was lies. So a lot of these guys have come out really not knowing what information is real, what is not. They can guess, they can make their own assumptions. But life goes on as well. And those guys have been in 4 years, so people have got older, life clicks on. Cities that, were intact when they were captured are now probably rubble for some of them. Certainly some of the guys I was fighting with in Mariupol, it was a real test of strength when they knew that Kherson had been taken without so much as a real fight. I mean, it was a fight, but minimal. But, they were still pushing on in Mariupol, not knowing what was happening to their families. And some of those are still in captivity nearly 4 years later. So when you do get out, you are jubilant. I don't remember being, ecstatically happy, or I thought I would be ecstatic when I got out. What I wanted to find out the gaps that were missing in my life while I was in captivity. These guys have got huge gaps. So, they would have been told as well misinformation, disinformation about the realities of what's going on. So they're going to be in for a big shock. And this is just the start of it. So, they do come about disorientated and not knowing what's happening. I think one of the clips that sticks with me is when they were informing a prisoner about what was going on in Kursk, and he was like, oh, what? We've just invaded Kursk, so it is, it's about when you get out an information gathering exercise as well as being reunited with family and looking visibly different as well than the last time they saw you. So, it's about a part now of that rebuilding exercise for them.
Yeah, I've heard from the Ukrainian and international journalists when they are waiting for the prisoners of war, and you never know who's going to come back. It's always very hard to see those family members who do not see their people coming back. That's the hardest part, and they are trying to ask, do you know this person? Yeah, that's very tough, and I hear it all the time. And yeah, you're right, Russia is creating a fake reality, delusional. With all the testimonies, Shaun, I was wondering, why do Russian authorities not seem concerned that released prisoners return home in a traumatized and devastated condition and speak publicly about what they experience? And you personally, you even wrote your own book. And these stories and images are seen not only in Ukraine, but worldwide. Your book in English as well. So why does Russia appear so indifferent to the reputational cost?
But it's double, really, sided. This it's one, they don't particularly care. Torture on the Russian side is systemic through from the the private matros level through to higher ups and generals. So it's systemic through the system, and generally Russian prisons are very, very bad. Anyway, I wasn't classed as a prisoner of war. I was actually trialed as a Nazi and a mercenary and a terrorist, which was, I'm none of those. So when you go into a prison system, I was in the general population, they're very, very bad. I estimate you probably got a life expectancy of about 5 years in a Russian prison because the food is so bad, the conditions are so bad, and they don't really care. They don't have any sort of moral bar when it comes to prisoners of war. So, initially you go through that initial shock of being captured. I was electrocuted, stabbed in the leg, starved. I was taken to a sham trial where I looked like I'd been in a Japanese war camp for, and some of those pictures where my back went straight into my legs, you could see my ribs. I dropped to 60 kilograms in weight. They didn't care. They want you to go back and tell those stories of the brutality so that it puts other people off. That's their mentality. And I'm not ignorant to say that war crimes don't happen on both sides, not in the slightest. But one of the reasons I went back to the invite of the Ministry of Defence is to go and see how the Russian prisoners were treated in Ukraine, which was positively like the Ritz-Carlton of prisons, nothing that I could even relate to when I was in captivity. They have a shop, they can work and earn money. Yeah, prison's prison. I didn't go there to make their life hell or I really wanted to go and see why Russia wasn't exchanging those born outside of Ukraine and Russia in prisoner swaps, because, that was one of the alarming things when I went there, was to see all those people from Africa and South America and Nepal and Sri Lanka who are now fighting for the Russians. So, it is... they live in a different world there. And when they're exchanged back, you can generally see when the Russians go back, they're not in the same spirits as the Ukrainians who come back. The Ukrainians are elated, crying on the floor. You can see the anxiety and the apprehension when the Russians go back, that they're not going to be, just because they come back as prisoners, their contracts are not going to be expunged. They're going to probably be turned around and sent straight back to the front line again. So, you can see the difference in the prisoners when they go back. The Russian prisoners look healthy. The Ukrainian prisoners look pale, white. This is Nazi-style filtration camps in the east of Ukraine that are holding these prisoners and in the most appalling conditions, torturing, beatings. Paul Urey was a British NGO worker, charity worker who was with us, who was beaten, essentially beaten to death, died of his injuries 2 days later. So, you know, it is the harshest environment you can imagine. And these guys have been there for 4 years, living on a knife edge, not being able to go to even a toilet on your own for 4 years. I mean, I distinctly remember that, having my first toilet on my own without my friends in the same room, or, you know, in a bunker or in a trench or somewhere, you know, I could have a break. So, you know, it goes as simple and as stupid as that, to be able to just do what you want to do, make some toast. And it can get quite emotional. And the Russians don't really care about the way they treat their prisoners. Like I said, it's systemic through the system. So, you know, the last thing they're worried about is human rights. And there are no, when I was in captivity, I wasn't given any rights to see Red Cross or even my consulate or anything like that. So, you know, all those basic human rights were just taken off me the whole time I was in captivity. So, you know, there are no humanitarian aid groups looking at prisoners, and they certainly didn't come and look at me. So this is why, you know, the state of they're in when they come back or you know, back to Ukraine.
And also several freed prisoners, and they said that the harshest treatment often came from DNR, LNR militants, the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic armed groups. Why is there often, and you were describing in your book the same, why is there often such visible hatred and cruelty from them?
I think, I mean, one thing that, I mean, the Russians are not stupid. They did all the nasty stuff to me, the electrocutions and the torture. How do I know they were Russian? They had Russian fatigues. They looked visibly different. They had all the good gear, fast helmets, you know, good optics, gangster grips. They had all the good chem lights, multi-tools. They looked visibly different from, you know, the Donetsk People's Republic militia, I call them, who normally got mixed camouflage. Looks like they've got borrowed gear. They look very second-rate soldiers, if that. So they look visibly different. And then they handed me to the MGB, which is like the Donetsk version of the FSB. And they look visibly different. And they're trained quite ridiculous in some of their questioning, really, that told me that they didn't do this as a profession. But all the while, the FSB and the Russians were in charge of the whole situation. And to the point where even when I went to trial, they were trying to use us as propaganda bait to really bring Britain into the war, to say they were responsible for us. When I'd lived in Ukraine, I was married to Ukrainian, I'd never actually left the country, I had legal residency in. So, you know, it's all a propaganda war at the start when you're initially captured. Even the trials are, I mean, you could argue it's a justice system. It's just not a system that it resembles any sort of justice. You know, it's a sham. It's a Putin trial. And it's led by Russian propaganda, which really is trying to form the narrative, tomorrow's narrative, so, and the justification for the war. So it's a real propaganda-led system, a media system that's, at the end of the day, when you do get your trial and your death penalty, it's really a paperwork exercise on top of the trial that's already happened, which is on the TV to the domestic audience and what it's trying to portray to the world. So it's a very difficult time for prisoners to be able to adjust coming home to that. I certainly found it very difficult to adjust, not initially, but once the cameras and the papers stopped, you come up, ultimately every prisoner sort of comes around to this question, well, what do I do next? You know, where do I go? How do I, and then all the realities of normal life come back, you know, work, bills, families, running, babysitting the kids, making sure people go to work and you know, car maintenance, filling up the car, you know, all those things come flooding back. And you haven't had to worry about that for, a year in captivity. So, it takes time to adjust to come back. But going back to your question, yeah, it's very, very difficult time for them. It's great if you've got family, but certainly when I got back, some of my family had died, unfortunately. Some of those would be walking into that as soon as they got off the bus. So, it is a pretty difficult time for them, even though they're home free.
Absolutely. I was reading the article, the interview of a human rights activist. She's a Russian, and she was giving an interview to Deutsche Welle, and she was saying that in Russia, the way they are treating Ukrainian prisoners, or the way they're treating them, that's actually coming from the top. So basically, it's coming from Putin, and that was because they have a vertical. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to allude to before. It is essentially, I never felt that the DPR, the LPR would treat me any different from the Russians. I mean, they tried to essentially separate the two, which was quite entertaining when a judge sort of said to me, do you see any Russians in here? And in the other room was a picture of Putin hanging up on the wall, So, and that was at my trial. So, and you can't say what you want to say. Even when we pleaded not guilty, you can't really say that. They told us you couldn't say that. And they stopped the cameras and made us change our plea, coercing us with so-called lawyers. Essentially, the one was a man when I first met. By the time I got to trial, it turned into this quite portly lady who was telling me that I can't plead not guilty. So, all the way through, by the time you get your sentence, you know what's coming anyway. So I never felt really I was treated any different from the DPR and the LPR because, one, it was all just governed by Russia. And Russia, trying to set tomorrow's narrative and justify the war, which is why they were really using us through the media as tools to be able to do that.
The last one on this topic, I was just wondering, why do Russian and occupation courts so often sentence Ukrainian prisoners of war to 25, 30 years in prison, other than just death penalty, but they usually do this 25, 30 years?
Well, my friend just came back to the director, a praporshchik of the Marines who got 29 years and 6 months. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's to really drive people from being in the Ukrainian military, set an example, deter them from fighting in those areas. The whole narrative, you've got to remember, for Putin was to denazify Ukraine. Over years now, since the start of full-scale invasion, that narrative is largely come undone by anybody with any brains, to be fair. So essentially, at the start of the war, they were looking at painting Mariupol like Brandenburg, and that's all changed. So the whole war and the whole propaganda side is really sort of morphing into something else now because, those aims for invading Ukraine are looking pretty slim pickings when you think that Putin wanted Kiev and now, after 4 years can't get out of Donetsk Oblast, after sustaining very, huge casualties. He's lost dominance of the Black Sea. He lost 1/3 of his nuclear tactical bombers. He's going to have to forcibly mobilize. I mean, and this is 4 years on. So although it's totally missold the Russian people on what he projected and, the 3-day war that's now turned into nearly 4 years and now their economy is teetering on top of it. So, I'm of the opinion that, the whole propaganda line is morphing into something else. There's definitely, we talked about last time, a power shift where, I don't think Ukraine is going to go and start digging in defense positions in Mariupol, but there's a certain power shift. Ukraine are now hitting oil refineries, and we don't go too much into that because we covered it, but then they're hitting oil refineries. They're firing into 200 drones a day into, Crimea and parts of Russia. Ballistics they're firing into Russia. you imagine saying you're going to launch ballistics into Russia in 2022 and see everybody then panic about, it escalated into something like a world war, a nuclear war. Now it's daily. I mean, there are drones going in and causing blackouts in Moscow and Belgrade and places like that. So, there is a power shift that's not gone in Russia's favour. And all that, now the propaganda, which includes the POWs and everything else, is now being sort of morphing into something else. First, it was selling victories, but now it's sort of doing damage limitation. Even what we're going to talk about shortly with Elon's, firm that's now supporting the Russians with their drone capabilities. So, it is Starlink's just another one in an embarrassment for the Russians, which now the propaganda's having to work overtime to try and fix. So, everything's changing. So, I mean, I've got to say, every POW exchanged is a positive thing. It's not peace. It is a byproduct of war. It's certainly nothing to do with the peace negotiations. Ukraine have been doing prisoner exchanges the time I've been here since 2018 and definitely since 2014. So, they have been. I'd like to think there's some, humanity in that still between the two countries. But after what I've been through with Russia, and the torture and the systemic torture and what goes on over there, normally, my cynical view is that it just means that they want somebody, or there's been a negotiation with somebody, and or they want to please Trump. Generally, there's another agenda for a prison swap. So I don't read too much into it in sort of imminent peace, but it certainly is. We want to promote as many prisoner exchanges as we can moving forward. But yeah, the summary is that I just think the propaganda situation across the board is changing in every aspect of this war.
Yeah, Shaun, I didn't know how to make a smooth transition from such a hard topic, the one that we discussed, to Starlinks, but you helped me. So, yeah, straight to the point. Let's talk about Starlink issue. It's striking to see how, strongly Russian forces react on social media, on Telegram channels, when they lose satellite connectivity and drone control. Why is Starlink access so strategically important on the battlefield today for Russia, especially?
Well, it goes again to the propaganda narrative that Russia pumps out of being this independent country and self-reliant and, the decadent West and, satanic West. I can list them as far as they go. It's another embarrassment because, it turns out that the Russian offensive is heavily reliant on Starlink, which is Western tech. It's bizarre. So it's just another embarrassment to a Russian military who claim to be the second most powerful in the world and who would take, Kiev in 3 days. And, they've had to get the help from Belarus to platform the invasion. They've got help from North Korea, Iran, China to a degree. They've got a foreign patchwork of mercenaries coming in to give them a hand. Still, they can't take Donetsk Oblast. And now they rely heavily on Starlink and, tech from the West. So, it's deeply embarrassing for a Russian military who spent years and years and years slagging off the West and, totally with their propaganda portraying this mighty Russia when essentially they're, running operations used in Western tech. So, yeah, I mean, I've seen the reports, but the propaganda essentially is turning anyway. I mean, what you're seeing is a lot of homegrown mill bloggers who are now turning on the leadership, criticising the leadership. Even last week, a politician was criticising the leadership about the SMO and how badly it's been run, who then promptly ended up in being charged for speaking against the military. So, this is where Russia's at the moment. When you start enforcing those sorts of rules at home, then it's fear. And Putin is clearly showing fear because of what's happening, which means his propaganda is going to be working overtime. And he's going to have to repress people more at home to keep people in order. This is where you start to see regimes like Putin, autocratic regimes and dictatorships, go very brittle now because, you know, all those lies and the propaganda. This is a country that spends more on propaganda than it does healthcare. So that should tell you everything. You know, when you're trying to you manipulate and set the narrative above health at home, then essentially you can see that why that's now sort of crumbling to a degree, and why, you know, Russian mill bloggers are turning against the leadership, because they're just fed up with needless lives, like, you know, being lost in a special military operation that's now, you know, encompassed 1.2 million Russian casualties and millions of, you know, people affected now by this war on both sides on the border. You know, Belgorod getting blackouts, Moscow hitting blackouts now, and you know, the price of oil has now gone up in Russia because Ukraine successfully hit all the oil refineries. What Russia's doing is recycling old sort of Kremlin Soviet playbooks now, hitting the power infrastructure of Ukraine. They essentially has had more success this year, but, you know, hasn't worked last winter or the winter before that. So, you know, he's spending billions on hitting winter, you know, the power infrastructure in Ukraine, as we talked about, but essentially with no guarantees of any sort of success. I mean, it's in March, you know yourself, next month, halfway through next month, we'll start getting the rays of sun and spring, and summer's around the corner. So, you know, he would have spent billions by then on trying to hit Ukrainian power infrastructure. For what? You know, it's not changed very much. People are more resilient now. The will to fight is still there. It hasn't changed very much. And it's not going to really get a breakthrough for the Russians at all. So, you know, he's just burning money, essentially, on a recycled plan with no new ideas. So you can see why Russian propaganda is getting, and Russian criticism of the leadership is growing.
And I don't know about your opinion about that, but you know what's interesting? That also Russian propaganda has recently tried to sound more positive about the United States leadership, praising certain figures and narratives. They were saying Dedushka Trump, Granny Trump. And yet at the same time, Elon Musk's decisions restrict Russian access to Starlink. I mean, what is your take on that?
My take is Trump's got midterms. Trump wants this done, I read, by June. I don't think he gives a flying meep for Ukrainians. I think he literally wants to get this for his midterm. He needs to win as much as Putin, I said to someone today. His polls are dropping. His public support across Europe is certainly plummeting. So unless you're in one of those sort of right-wing parties. So he needs a pick-me-up as much as Putin, who's clearly searching for any sort of win now, because his military, he's now relying upon Trump to try and give him the rest of Donetsk, because he's failed to take it in 11 years. So, you know, I think Putin has never been under this much pressure. I think his PR and propaganda is working overtime to try and create false stories. Look at Kupiansk, look at Pokrovsk. Putin himself said, invited journalists to come and see Pokrovsk and witnessed the encirclement and the downfall of the city. Yet, several months later, it's still there, still fighting. Hasn't moved very far, meters gained. Ukrainians are still, in the fight there. So, Kupiansk was just another embarrassment for the regime, the Putin. So, with Zelensky visited. So, it's inevitable this is going to change. Things are going to change. And I think Putin is really on his last legs with the propaganda now and trying to get something from Trump, because if the lines freeze where they are, Putin's going to take home a loss. I mean, he's not going to have captured anywhere near where he said he was going to capture. He was going to go after Kiev 3 days. He's annexed far more territory than he controls, that he doesn't look like he's ever going to get. The economy is teetering. people's lives have got harder in Russia. And then, he's having problems hiding the 1.2 million casualties that are coming back either in a box or looking like Transformers for the rest of their life. It's him. All blood lies with Putin and this bizarre SMO that's failed, that he's still trying to revive through political talks to Trump. And Trump's entertaining it, which is even worse. Since his inauguration, attacks across cities in Ukraine have risen. This is not de-escalating. This is a Russian leader who sees weakness and who's escalating the problems in Ukraine. So, Trump can go on about Biden all day long, but, Biden, for all his faults, it wasn't this bad under Biden. Biden didn't want to escalate, but he didn't stop military sharing or pull humanitarian aid or, Trump was stopping artillery rounds before he became president. So, this is all about politics and visuals, and Trump needs it before the midterms. He's going to be crushed through the midterms. So he knows it, everybody knows it, and we're sort of expecting it. So, yeah, going back to what he said, he needs to win just as much as Putin at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard Zelensky said that they set up a deadline for Ukraine and Russia to finish the war. No, just to stop a fight until summer. That's interesting. Say it to Russia, don't say it to Ukraine. And just another more... another more, Shaun, about the Starlink. SpaceX is a private company, right? It's not the U.S. government company. However, there is a discussion about Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, this white list for authorized access of Starlink. Could this be interpreted by Russia as de facto U.S. participation on Ukraine's side? And does that interpretation matter at all?
I don't think so. I believe he stopped it in Kherson when Ukraine were advancing at quite a rapid speed to retake the city. So, it's balanced there, I think. I wouldn't trust... I think Fedorov is a really good guy that Ukraine have brought in, who's very tech-savvy, who after that, already found alternatives to Starlink. It's not my speciality, if I'm truly honest, but certainly I would say, the Russians are now openly talking about finding get-rounds. I didn't realise, to be honest, how reliant they were on Starlink, but looking at Telegram chats, it looks devastating for him. It's going to slow advances up even more than the snail's pace that they're going on now. I mean, it's according to stats, it's the slowest advance ever since World War One to take anywhere. I mean, look at how long it's taken to take Pokrovsk. They started the offensive there 2 years ago. So, they're not making good ground. They're going to have a forced mobilization if they are to make ground. I think they will find a workaround. They are learning on the front lines. When I talk to my friends, they talk to me and say it's changed immensely since 2022, and they are learning. And the manufacturing has gone up in the production of drones. So it is something to watch. Where they go from here, I don't know. I think it's unlocked a level of corruption in the Russian military. So obviously, we could see a spate of Russians now being jailed for corruption. I mean, it's deeply embarrassing for Russia, to be so reliant on some American tech and to have it all stopped while you're on an operation in another country trying to take the government. It is beneficial to Ukraine that that's the case. I'm so happy that they acted quickly to be able to do that. But yeah, I mean, it's a watch this space moment. I mean, this war's evolving every 2 or 3 months into another catastrophe for Russia. I'm always the assumption that the longer this war goes on, the more Ukraine stands to benefit and probably more likely to win because of Ukraine have been absolutely amazing at exploiting every Russian weakness for the world to see. you know, through long-range drones into Russia, ballistics into Russia, hitting Russian, you know, oil refineries, to, you know, taking out 35% of the Black Sea fleet, enough to get them to move from the Black Sea with, you know, out of conventional navy. So this is a remarkable war to watch from the outside in, and see how it, you know, it's changing modern warfare. And, you know, these other fronts that are sort of materializing, the economic fronts, they're going to have more, and the political are going to have more prevalence, not so much the battlefield. You know, it just can't see Russia even getting a breakthrough. So, you know, I think economically, you know, as I've said before on the show, if economically Russia collapses, which it has done before, you can end up walking to the occupied territories without a shot being fired. So, you know, a year ago we were being laughed at when we talked like this, and now people are looking at it thinking, well, actually, this could happen.
Absolutely. You know, how many forecasts I've heard about the ending the war. The latest was from, I think, Politico. They were citing some expert, and he was saying the war will end by spring, by March. I'm sure you was reading about that. Then this one, the deadline from the United States to end the war by the beginning of summer. And, you know, it's easy to get lost in such a lot of tone on information, especially when you are hoping for the war to end, especially when you are living in Ukraine. So, yeah, Shaun, actually, we have unpacked a lot today. So thank you so much for that, and I'm waiting for you for the next time.
Yeah, no problems. Thanks for having me.
Thank you,
Goodbye,
Shaun.
everybody.
Thank you, Shaun.